Advent, it really is a beautiful time of the year as we just gather together and just start to get our heads and our hearts around what does it mean that God came into our world. Today we're looking at the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel, and if you have your Bibles with you, you might like to open it and follow along with me as we look at some of the verses today. You might have noticed, and Loretta may have been quite relieved actually, that we picked up the reading at verse 18. And so if you know Matthew chapter 1, open it up and have a quick look and you'll understand perhaps a bit of Loretta's relief this morning. The first 17 verses are the genealogy or the family tree of Jesus. It's a very long list of names, some of them extremely difficult to pronounce, some of them possibly impossible to pronounce, and in all reality, we don't know that many people on the list. Mark's Gospel opens very differently. The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Thank you very much. Straight to it, like Mark typically is. But Matthew painstakingly tracks back. Actually, I'm not doing my math quick enough. It's a lot of generations. It's 14 generations, then another 14, then another 14. But it's a whole list of tracking back the family of Jesus, tracing all the way back to Abraham. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, surely Jesus' family tree would be a list of the who's who in Israel's history. The bigwigs, the men and women, mighty faith, you know, the heroes of the faith. And sure, there are some people like that in the family tree whom God used in mighty ways to accomplish his purposes. But the list also contains a bunch of very imperfect people, some fairly shady characters, some average Joes and Marys, and all in all, a collection of individual stories of drama, failure, suffering, and poor choices. That seems to be the norm in Jesus' DNA, his earthly DNA. A number of years ago, I was at a men's Bible weekend, and the special guest was from the Wycliffe Bible translators. And he was sharing with us stories of missionaries working in very scattered parts of the world, translating the Bible into local dialects. And I remember one story he told us that has stayed with me. It's of a man went to a remote tribe and started with Matthew's Gospel. And like us this morning, he decided to skip the first 17 verses. After he finished each section, he would take it to the local people to read. After he'd done the translation, he would take it to the local people to read. And he was expecting the gospel to speak for itself. But actually he got a bunch or a series of polite and muted responses from the local people. He went on and got into the teaching and the healing narratives of Jesus. And again, the response was really quite ho-hum. Surely the passion narratives would do it. Surely that would get them across the line. But nothing. Crickets. And so, a bit devastated, downtrodden, disheartened, he finished up with the resurrection and then the Great Commission. And he gave it to them, but by now he pretty much expected their response. And again, muted, not really anything. And so, more as a perfunctory action, the missionary decided to go back to the very beginning of the gospel so that he could at least give them a finished product. He translated painstakingly the list of names that make up the genealogy of Jesus, and he handed it to them. Matthew's gospel was now complete, but he thought his ministry there was a complete and utter failure. However, And you may be able to guess where this is going. As they read through the family tree of Jesus, he noticed their growing excitement. And their exclamation by the time they got to verse 18 was, "Why didn't you tell us this was a true story?" Chapter 1 of Matthew's Gospel introduces us to Jesus' very ordinary family tree. By the time we get to verse 25, where Loretta finished up, any loose ends or grey area concerning Jesus' parentage are all tied up. Joseph names him Jesus, and by doing so accepts him as his son, bringing Jesus into Joseph's family. But before he does that, before Joseph accepts Jesus as his son, we have an immaculate conception, a whole lot of drama, the very real and likely threat of a relationship breakdown, scandal, gossip, an angel of the Lord that comes in the middle of the night and instructs Joseph on how to proceed. None of which is ordinary. So what do we take from this reading today? Well, let's start with how it might have been understood and heard by Matthew's first audience. Matthew's Gospel was written to the Messianic Jews who had fled Jerusalem after the destruction of the great temple. They had gone to Antioch, another great city in the Mediterranean world. So Messianic Jews, this is the audience. They're Jewish people that believe that Jesus was their Messiah. And they were a small but growing subset within the Jewish community in that day. But like many other scattered communities, they were torn apart by intense grief and tremendous struggle. Their whole world had been torn apart, literally. Let me explain. The year 70 AD, Jerusalem was at boiling point. The tension between the Jewish people and the Roman occupiers had reached boiling point. You just knew something was about to break out. There had been numerous revolts in the preceding years. And finally, the Roman Emperor Vespasian had had enough. So he gave the order to his son, General Titus, to finish off the rebellious Jewish people once and for all. The Roman army marched into the centre of Jerusalem and they levelled the temple. Systematically, stone by stone, they removed the temple from existence. There is no equivalent to what Rome did on this day. The temple was considered to be the architectural jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean world, but it was so much more than that. It was the epicentre of their faith, their culture, their very livelihood. On that day, the high altar was completely shattered. Every stone, and if you've ever seen any images of what we believe the temple looked like, there was a lot of stones. Every stone was carried outside the city wall and dumped. Every stone. All of the temple scrolls, the Torah, was all burnt, and every vessel, every religious artefact completely destroyed. The priests, their scribes, the temple officials, and all of their families were massacred. Tens of thousands of people were killed on this day. There was nothing left. There was nothing left for the Jewish people to pin their hope and their faith upon. What we have today, if you look at photos of Jerusalem, the Western or the Wailing Wall, that's the retaining wall at the very far western side of where the temple used to be. There was no looting. The orders were very specific: destroy everything. And everything was destroyed. So can you imagine then, if you're a Jewish believer and the temple was just the epicenter of their life and faith. It was gone. And so these people scattered around the Mediterranean world. And so for Matthew's first audience, they lived in Antioch. But their faith had been dealt a cruel and catastrophic blow. And so nothing short of a rebirth was going to be needed for their faith to go on. So can you imagine this community reading the first chapter of Matthew's Gospel? What that might mean for them. See, we don't know the names. We know some of the names in that family tree, in that genealogy, but they would have known every name and the drama behind every name. They would have known the twists and plot turns and failures, but God keeps showing up. And God still working through very, very ordinary people throughout their history. It was their story. It was their history. And it tells a story of a God who prevails when all seems lost. And many times throughout their history, all seemed lost. But it's a story of a rebirth of faith, because God will again work through the lives of very ordinary people, just like them, just like us. That's the story of the first 17 verses of Matthew chapter 1. A story of a very faithful God who keeps working time and time again. It's a grand story of providential care where the purposes of God keep being looked after through the lives of very ordinary people. Sure, they come from the family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Tamar, Ruth. Some of them were pretty shady characters, but God kept working through their lives. And finally, we get to Joseph, the husband of Mary, whom Jesus was born. Joseph features in Matthew's early chapters. In Luke, we read last week, it's Mary who really features. But in Joseph's story, as he recounts this, it's Joseph who takes centre stage. But it's not really a birth narrative here in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's trying to give his audience something altogether different to hang their new faith on. Matthew's telling the story how faith gets tested, how life can be really challenging. And so Joseph presents a model for how to navigate that, how to live a life of courage when everything is collapsing around him. How do you stay true to God? How do you follow after God's purposes when you actually have no idea what to do next? That's the story of Joseph. You see, Joseph faced a great dilemma. He was engaged to Mary, and so in those days, it's kind of like effectively he was married to Mary, but they weren't allowed to live with each other yet. And so Joseph finds out that Mary's already pregnant. And so try to put your heart and mind now in Joseph's shoes. It's only quite natural that he would feel betrayed, trapped, and just how aware his public shaming will be. Joseph's devastated. He lives in a small village. I don't know if you've ever lived in a small village or a country town, or you grew up in a country town, but they're a little bit different. They work a little bit differently to cities, We don't know our neighbours, but if they had a squabble over the evening meal, the whole village would have known by morning. That's the kind of life that Joseph grew up in. Joseph's village was governed by social approval and the strong arm of elderly wisdom or elderly gossip. One of the two. You can take it how you want to interpret it. But there were very clear expectations on how to live and how it was appropriate to respond to certain situations. I don't know what the appropriate response is to your betrothed becoming pregnant and it's not you. But you can kind of imagine the mess that Joseph's in, can't you? Joseph's in a real mess. Should he risk the ruin of his family name? Should he expose Mary's betrayal? And so Joseph unreflectively did what was expected by his society and decided to quietly ask Mary to leave. It all sounds so polite, doesn't it? I'm going to say that again. Joseph unreflectively did what was expected by his society and decided to quietly ask Mary to leave. But God had other ideas. An angel of the Lord appears to him in the still of night, and that got Joseph's attention. Do not fear to take Mary as your wife. The Holy Spirit is the divine force behind this conception. Keep the child, raise him as your own, name him Jesus. He will be Emmanuel. He will save his people from their sins. The mess didn't magically go away. There would still be fear. There would still be the uncomfortable navigating of village gossip. And that gossip and speculation stayed with Jesus his entire life. And I wonder how much of it Joseph had to navigate in the ongoing years. You might remember when Jesus starts his ministry in Luke chapter 4, and they say, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" In that kind of mocking kind of innuendo. The angel of the Lord doesn't fix everything for Joseph, but it gives him a way forward. Joseph becomes a model of courage and trust for the early church. This is how you do it. Joseph became a model of courage and trust for the early church, in case you missed that. Their new world is being rebuilt. Their faith is being rebuilt. Will they trust in the leading of God? So what do we take away from this? I hope you've seen how Matthew's first community might have responded. But what do we do with the roller coaster of emotions? How it must have been for Joseph. From the dizzying heights of getting engaged and planning a wedding to the gut-wrenching low of discovering that Mary's already pregnant. I imagine there were days when Joseph didn't want to get out of bed. Waking up was all too hard because when he woke up, he had to face the reality of his world. He had to face his village. He had to face his neighbours again. When he woke up, there was that sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. There was fear, confusion, anger. What do you do when you don't quite know what to do next? When your life goes through a change, and our lives go through change all too often, don't they? When health changes, life at work can change, relationships can change. What do you do when your life goes through big change and you wake up with that sick feeling in the pit of your stomach, not knowing what to do. Do you get that? I'm hoping it's not just me that sometimes wakes up with that kind of feeling of a day that's looming ahead of me. For some of us, that change can rattle our confidence a little, and it can shake us up. And for some of us, sometimes the change seems to be huge, and it might feel like the destruction of a temple. And we are left sitting in a rubble, and we have no idea what to do next. What do you do when you're in the rubble? I think that's the question of Matthew chapter 1 for us this year. What do you do when you don't know quite how to respond? I think there's three options for us. The first option is to be very unreflective. Just listen to what people tell you and go along with what you think is the right thing to do. What's expected? That's possibly easy option. It's tidy, it's polite, it's not really a mess, but there's not a great deal of courage and trust in that option. The second option tends to be where I think most of us go today. It's that we numb the pain and the confusion, and the rubble surprisingly becomes a little less messy, and we get used to rubble. We numb it in a way that kind of gives us a little less confusion, but a little bit more relief. Not complete relief, just enough relief for it to be effective. Whatever the degree of injury, all addiction is a kind of refugee story, from intolerable feelings incurred through adversity and never quite processed, into a state of temporary freedom, even if it's just an illusion. The book I'm reading at the moment discovers or tries to convey this changing narrative of, we used to see addiction as something that was fairly minor, put to the background, and we don't talk about too much. But the author, who's a respected doctor, is talking about addiction now is almost the normative response to when our lives get a bit unmanageable. We've got lots of ways of finding temporary relief in our world today. From shopping. We could do it through shopping. Spending money gives us temporary relief. Christmas can give us a bit of a temporary relief from our world. It can be really, really hard and challenging, and we see somebody singing carols that looks cute, and so we enter into that season without really reflecting on what we're going through. There are substances, there are behaviours, there are lots of things that can be our refugee story, giving temporary relief. Or we can follow, the third option is to follow God's way, which is the story of courage and trust and healing and purpose. Now that requires something pretty special, like an angel who appears in the still of night. But you've got three options, okay? The first option, unreflective, just do what's expected of you. The second option, seek some temporary relief, somehow, somewhere. Or the third option is to be open to the fact that God may want to lead you in a new path. An angel appears in the still of night. During the day, Joseph was preoccupied, I imagine, with worry and fear and concern. But at night time, things are a little different. You might have had a chance to read the reflection I wrote a few years ago in the newsletter this week. Nighttime, our posture is very different. When we do get to sleep, our posture is one of trust, where we are held. And we just keep breathing. And we wake up and God's been with us all through the night. There's this posture of stillness in our busy, frantic world that's really, really difficult to arrive at, to obtain, to live out. That's the third option, though. You know, that posture became a bit of a habit for Joseph. If you read through the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, he gets a few visits in the next few chapters. An angel warns him about going to Egypt, and an angel comes and tells him again when it's time to come back. Joseph found a way, a habit, a way of living that he heard the Lord guide and direct his path. All the mess doesn't go away. But he becomes the protector of a vulnerable family. He becomes the protector of Emmanuel, our God with us. So we're going to sing a song together. I wonder how you're doing the mess and rubble that you find yourself in your day-to-day life. Are you the quick to react kind of person who doesn't really think things through but is happy to take advice from anywhere and unreflectively just do what you think is expected? Are you the person that just seeks some relief anywhere, somehow? And it's addictive, be it a behaviour, be it a substance, be it work, shopping, spending. It can be anything, really. It gives us a bit of temporary relief. And that's why it's addictive, because it's temporary. It kind of works. But it doesn't work well enough for it to be life-changing. And we get stuck in that place. And there are so many of us that get stuck in that place. Or there's a third option, to hear the voice of God, leading you with new purpose in a direction that seems so counterintuitive perhaps, but it changes everything. And so as our team sing this morning, I'm going to invite you to reflect perhaps on the strategy that you're using at the moment. And the third option, it's not our natural position, because we're not in charge. But if you crave this morning that third option, where you just need to hear God lead you into a life of purpose, into a life of healing, I'm going to invite you to respond to Jesus this morning, because the other two ways don't work.